The briefing lasted 11 minutes. Rhee timed it. Admiral Casson delivered it standing, which meant he didn't want anyone getting comfortable. The room was a standard operations deck on the Ardent Meridian, grey walls, recessed lighting that buzzed at a frequency slightly too high for comfort, a holographic display table that kept flickering at the edges no matter how many times the techs recalibrated it. 4 chairs around the table. Rhee sat in hers with both feet flat on the floor and her hands loosely folded, a posture she had trained herself into years ago because it looked like patience even when she felt none. Tav sat beside her and said nothing. He rarely said anything in briefings. He absorbed. The other 2 seats were occupied by Specialist Oren Das, their systems operator, a compact woman with close-cropped hair and the kind of stillness that came from genuine calm rather than performed professionalism, and Private Len Chaw, 22 years old, 8 months out of combat training, who was technically their biology specialist and had never been deeper than 400 meters. Rhee had read all their files twice on the transport in. Casson pulled up the satellite image and the room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something on a screen is actively wrong. Skarath. The ocean moon. She'd seen the standard briefing images before. The surface from orbit looked almost peaceful, a marble of deep blue and grey-green, cloud systems spiraling over nothing but water for thousands of kilometers in every direction. No structures. No settlements. The Skarath had never shown any documented interest in it beyond a single survey mission 14 years ago that Command had logged and filed and essentially forgotten. The deep scan image was different. It looked, at first, like an error in the rendering software. A dense, irregular mass of overlapping geometric signals 3 kilometers below the surface, spanning roughly 4 kilometers across at its widest point. The signals were shielded, Casson explained. Heavily. The satellite had only caught it because of a brief power fluctuation 11 days ago, a momentary drop in the shielding that lasted less than 4 seconds before correcting. 4 seconds was enough. We don't know what it is, Casson said. We know it's Skarath construction. We know it's powered. We know it's grown by approximately 8% since the initial scan. He paused. That last part is the part that concerns us. Rhee looked at the image. She thought about something growing, 3 kilometers underwater, in the dark, and she kept her expression neutral. The submersible was a Meridian-class deep-dive vessel, military specification, rated to 5 kilometers depth under normal crew conditions. Its name, stenciled on the port side in faded white letters, was Belay. It was 40 meters long and smelled, inside, of recycled air and machine oil and the particular metallic undertone that accumulated in sealed spaces after years of use. Rhee had piloted worse. Tav ran the pre-launch checks beside her without being asked. His hands moved across the instrument panels with a kind of fluid precision that was difficult to watch without thinking about the fact that his hands were not entirely human hands, the fingers slightly longer than the proportional standard, the joints more numerous, a barely perceptible iridescence in the skin at the knuckles that only showed under certain light frequencies. He was 31. He had his mother's coloring and his father's bone structure and a Skarath pressure tolerance that Command had spent 2 years trying to document before concluding it was simply a biological inheritance too complex to fully quantify. He'd been assigned because of the pressure tolerance. Rhee understood that. She didn't resent it. She was, herself, the best deep-water commander in the theater, which was why she was here. They were both instruments the mission required. Descent path looks clean, Tav said. Agreed. Watch the thermal variance around the 800-meter mark. The satellite data flagged a current anomaly. Already flagged. He glanced at her sideways. I read the same data. I know. A beat. Are you doing the thing where you brief me on things I know? He said. I'm doing the thing where I make sure we're aligned. We're aligned. Behind them, Das was running diagnostics on the sensor array with the quiet focus of someone who trusted hardware more than conversation. Chaw was pale and staring at his own console screen and not, strictly speaking, looking at anything on it. Rhee turned back to her instruments. Outside the forward viewport, the surface of Skarath was a plate of dark water under a sky that was not quite black. Skarath's parent gas giant, Oskal, provided a diffuse ambient light that made the ocean look pewter rather than dark, a flat and depthless color that gave nothing away. They dropped at 0300 shipboard time. The descent was, for the first hour, the most mundane kind of terrifying. The water closed over the belay with a sound like pressure equalizing, a deep, resonant thud that Rhee felt in her sternum, and then there was only the sound of the engines and the creaking of the hull and the darkness outside the viewports that deepened by degrees as the surface light faded. At 100 meters it was still possible to see the faint silver shimmer of the surface above them. At 300 meters it was gone. The current anomaly Tav had flagged hit them at 812 meters. The belay shuddered sideways with enough force to throw Chor against his restraints, and Rhee felt the yoke fight back against her correction, not like mechanical resistance, but something more organic, like trying to push through something that was pushing back. Thermal spike, Das said, her voice entirely level. 42 degrees above ambient and dropping. We're through it. The hull settled. The current released them, or they passed beyond its reach. It was impossible to tell which. Note the depth, Tav said. 812. Rhee noted it. Any idea what caused it? Not yet. Below 800 meters, the water changed quality. This was the kind of thing that Rhee knew intellectually, that deep ocean water was not a uniform medium, that it had layers and gradients and thermal structures, but knowing it and feeling it were different propositions. The belay moved differently down here. More slowly, as though the water had thickened, though the instruments showed nothing abnormal. The hull sounds changed pitch. The recycled air tasted, somehow, staler, though that was impossible. Chor said, very quietly, how far? Roughly 2 kilometers to target depth, Tav said. 90 minutes at current descent rate. Chor nodded and said nothing else. At 1200 meters, the exterior lights caught something. Das put it on the main display before Rhee could ask. A field of what appeared to be pale, thread-like structures drifting at the edge of the light cone, moving gently with the microcurrents the belay was generating. They were organic-looking. Long and fine, almost translucent, some of them 3 or 4 meters in length. They moved without apparent propulsion, without any biological urgency, simply drifting. Identification. Rhee said. Nothing in the database, Das said. Could be a bioluminescent organism. Could be a feeding structure. Could be debris. Debris doesn't look like that, Chor said. Nobody disagreed with him. Tav was looking at the display with an expression Rhee could not quite read. Not alarm. Something more internal, a stillness that was different from his baseline stillness, concentrated in a way she noticed without being able to articulate. You recognize them, she said quietly. He didn't answer immediately. Then, no. It wasn't a lie, exactly. She could tell that much. But it wasn't the complete truth either, and she filed it away without pressing, because they were at 1200 meters and there was nothing to be done about anything at this depth except continue down. The thread-like structures became more numerous over the next 300 meters and then, abruptly, disappeared. They passed through a thermocline at around 1500 and the water on the other side was colder by 8 degrees, and darker, if darkness had degrees at this depth, which was a question Rhee was not prepared to interrogate. The exterior lights seemed to reach less far. She increased their intensity and the instruments confirmed the increase and the visible cone remained the same size, which meant the water was absorbing the light, which was not a normal property of water. At 2700 meters, Das said, I have the structure. She put it on the main display. The scan image resolved slowly. The sensor array was working against the shielding, reading what the shield allowed to leak, and what emerged was wrong in a way that took Rhee a full 10 seconds to understand. She had expected to see something built. Angles. Defined edges. The geometry of construction. The structure had edges, but they were not straight. It curved. It folded back on itself in places. It had, protrusions was the wrong word, but there was no better one, organic extensions that did not conform to any architectural logic she had seen in Skarath design, and she had seen enough of their work to know their aesthetic preferences. They built in planes. They built with precision. They built things that looked like weapons or tools or monuments because everything they constructed was meant to be read as deliberate. This looked like something that had been grown rather than built. How big is it? Rhee said. Main body, roughly 4.5 kilometers across, Das said. The extensions add another 2 to 3 in places. She paused. It's bigger than the satellite data suggested. By how much? The 8% growth estimate was conservative. I'm reading closer to 30. Nobody spoke for a moment. Take us down slowly, Rhee said. I want passive sensors only until we're at visual range. Kill everything we don't need. Tav began shutting down non-essential systems with methodical calm. The interior lighting dimmed. The hum of the engines dropped. The belay descended in near silence, and the structure below them grew on the display, and Rhee watched it and thought about what Casson had said, we don't know what it is. At 3 kilometers, they crossed through the last layer of thermal shielding and saw it with their own eyes. The exterior lights of the belay reached the structure's surface at approximately 30 meters of distance, and what they illuminated was not a wall. It was a membrane. Pale, slightly translucent at its thinner points, rippling with an extremely slow pulse that Rhee initially mistook for the effect of the belay's propulsion wash. But the pulse was independent. It ran from some interior point outward in long, lazy waves, visible in the way that a jellyfish is visible in dark water, not by what it showed but by the displacement it created, the way light bent slightly around it. "It's biological," Chaw said. His voice had changed. He sounded like a biologist now, which was to say, afraid and fascinated in equal proportion. "The whole outer surface, that's not a constructed material. That's tissue. Can you get a sample?" Das asked. "Not without puncturing it, and I do not recommend puncturing it." Rhee was already navigating the belay laterally along the surface, looking for an entrance. The satellite data had suggested openings, pressure equalization points in the shielding pattern, and she had their approximate coordinates. She found the first one 700 meters to port, a sphincter-shaped aperture roughly 60 meters across, currently dilated, open like a dark mouth in the membrane wall. "That's our way in," she said. Tav looked at it. It opened itself. "Yes. Sphincters don't open themselves unless something caused them to." "I know. Something either sensed us and opened, or something passed through recently." "I know." She held the belay steady 30 meters from the aperture and checked every passive sensor reading available to her. No movement inside the opening. No thermal signatures approaching from within. The aperture remained dilated, patient-looking, which was not a word she wanted to use about an orifice in a biological structure but was nonetheless the accurate one. It simply waited. "We go in," she said. "Minimum thrust. I want us moving at 3 meters per second maximum. No active pinging. If there's anything inside that navigates by sonar, I don't want us to announce ourselves." She looked back at Chaw. "Anything moves toward us, you tell me immediately. You don't assess it first, you don't try to identify it, you tell me and then you assess." Chaw nodded. The belay moved forward into the dark. The aperture was wider than it looked from outside. They cleared it with 20 meters to spare on each side, and beyond it was a transitional space, roughly cylindrical, the walls the same slow-pulsing membrane material as the exterior. It was perhaps 200 meters long and smelled, Rhee realized, of something. The belay's external samplers were pulling air. There was air in here, which was not what she had expected, and it had a quality that the instruments classified as organic compounds, complex, unidentified. To Rhee it smelled like warm water and something green, and underneath that something else, something she didn't have a word for. Tav's hands had stilled on the instrument panel. "You smell that?" she said. "Yes." "What is it?" A pause. "I don't know." Again, not a lie. Again, not everything. She let it go. They passed through the transitional cylinder and entered the nursery. There are no words, in the language Rhee had grown up speaking, for the scale of what was inside the structure. She understood, later, in the months of debriefings that followed, that this was not a failure of perception. The human perceptual system, the one she operated with, was genuinely not calibrated for spaces of this kind. The interior of the structure was roughly 4 kilometers across at its widest point, and the ceiling, if it could be called that, was visible only because of what hung from it. The floor, if it could be called that, was visible because it moved. The belay drifted into the space and Rhee held it there, 50 meters inside the entrance, and for a long moment everyone on board was simply silent. The ceiling was hung with structures she eventually understood were sacs. Organic sacs, rounded and full, varying in size from roughly 2 meters across to perhaps 15, connected to each other and to the ceiling membrane by networks of pale filaments that were almost certainly vascular. They hung in layers, staggered in depth, thousands of them visible in the light cone and more beyond in the darkness. The lights of the belay could not reach the far wall. They were not bioluminescent, but they were not dark either. They had a quality of translucent opacity that let through a faint interior glow, amber-colored, organic feeling, like something alive was producing light as a byproduct of processes not intended to be seen. Rhee looked at the floor and understood what was moving there. The bottom of the structure was a continuous, slow churning, biological matter in some state of productive decomposition or synthesis, impossible to distinguish from here, and moving through it were things she could not look at directly without losing her understanding of scale. They were large. At this distance she read them as roughly the size of the belay, 40 meters, but that was imprecise because they had no fixed shape. They moved by shape change. They extruded themselves forward in one direction and contracted from another, and they moved without haste, without apparent awareness of anything above them, tending to the floor matter the way hands tend a garden. "Those are the tenders," Chaw whispered. "They're maintaining something. The floor medium, its substrate. A growth medium. They're farming it. Farming what? Das said. Chaw pointed upward, at the sacs. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. How many of those sacs are there? Rhee said. Chaw's hands moved over his instruments. At a conservative estimate, given the space, he stopped. Started again. Several thousand. At minimum. Rhee looked at the sacs, glowing their faint amber in the dark, moving slightly with the currents that the tender's movements produced. Several thousand. Full and waiting. Almost ready to surface, Casson had said, based on the power readings. Almost ready. She understood now what Command had sent them to find, and she understood why Command had sent them alone, because an army would have made noise, and noise was not what you wanted to make in here. We need to get to the central mass, she said, her voice as low as she could make it. The satellite data showed a power concentration in the center of the structure. That's where the oldest sacs are going to be. That's what I need Chaw to assess. To get to center, we have to fly through them, Tav said. Yes. He looked at the hanging sacs, the moving tenders below, the dark space between. The tenders navigate this space. If we move at similar speed, similar path, yes. We'll look like one of them from a distance. Maybe. Maybe. It's what we have. He took a breath, a small thing, barely visible, but she caught it, and put his hands back on his co-pilot panel. Show me the path. She charted it on his display, a route that followed the apparent travel patterns of the visible tenders, staying to the mid-level of the space, between the hanging sacs and the churning floor, avoiding the densest clusters of filament connections where the ceiling was lowest. It would take approximately 40 minutes to reach the structural center at the speed she intended. Das, Rhee said. Full passive recording. Everything. Already running. Chaw. I need you looking out the port viewport. Don't use active sensors. Don't ping anything. Your eyes only. Chaw swallowed. Copy. The belay moved. The first sac they passed within close range of was roughly 8 meters across, and Rhee held herself at 2 meters per second and tried not to look at it directly. What she saw in peripheral vision was enough, the faint interior glow pulsing in a rhythm that was close to, but not identical with, a heartbeat. The outer membrane slightly elastic, slightly glossy, with surface texture like skin. Inside, a shape. Not clearly defined. Not fully formed. Curled, as things curl when they are not yet ready to be uncurled. Chaw said nothing. He was recording with his instruments and his eyes, and something in the quality of his silence suggested he was recording with his whole body, with every sensory surface, against his will. They moved deeper. The tenders did not react to them. Whether this was because the belay was an adequate imitation or because the tenders simply did not categorize moving objects as threats in this space, which implied a comfort with this space that was itself deeply disturbing, Rhee could not say. She watched them move below her as she moved above, and tried to learn the rhythm of their movement, to stay predictable, to stay ignorable. 20 minutes in, they reached a cluster of larger sacs, 12 to 15 meters across, and she had to navigate around them because the route she'd planned was blocked by a filament net she hadn't been able to see from the entrance. She altered course by 11 degrees and moved laterally, and one of the sacs passed within 3 meters of the forward viewport. From 3 meters away, through the membrane, Rhee could see what was inside it. She did not let herself react. She registered what she saw, the size, the form, the state of development, the way it moved even in this contained state, the way it oriented as they passed as though something in it was aware of them even before it was ready to be aware of anything, and she stored it and kept her hands on the controls and kept the belay moving at 2 meters per second on a path toward the center of the structure. She became, in that moment, a person who knew something she could not unknow, and she understood that whatever Command did with the information they brought back, she would carry the image for the rest of her life. Rhee, Tav said. His voice was strange. She looked at him. His hands were on the panel, but they were not doing what they usually did. They were resting on the panel, open, palms slightly down, as though they were waiting for something or feeling for something, a tactile attention, like listening through skin. His eyes were open and aimed at his instruments but not reading them. His face had an expression she had never seen on it and could not name. Tav. He didn't respond immediately. Tav. I need your eyes. He pulled back into himself by degrees. She saw it happen, a slow return, like surfacing from depth. He blinked. Looked at his instruments and actually read them this time. Sorry, he said. I'm here. She watched him for 3 more seconds. Then she looked back at the navigation path. They reached the structural center 18 minutes later. The center of the structure was a different space from the outer nursery. Here the sacs were largest, some of them 30 meters across, some larger, hanging lower from the ceiling so that navigating between them required Rhee's full attention, and they were not glowing amber but something deeper, more red, a color that was close to the color of living tissue seen from inside, the color of a hand held against a bright light. The floor below was still, here. No tenders. Whatever the floor medium was doing in this space, it was doing it without assistance, a process so advanced it no longer needed tending. Chor had been making low, involuntary sounds for the last 10 minutes. Not words. Just the sounds a person makes when their categories of understanding keep failing to accommodate what they're perceiving. Rhee understood this and left him to it because she was doing something similar in silence. Central sac cluster, Das said. 37 degrees to port, range 60 meters. Rhee brought the belay around and held it. The central cluster was not sacs in the sense the outer ones were. It was something further developed, 6 structures, oval rather than round, each approximately 40 meters in length, their surfaces ridged with what looked like early musculature. They were not simply glowing. They were lit from within by a pulsing that had the definite quality of biological process, something circulating, something metabolizing, something heating itself from the inside because it was about to be done with this space. They're ready, Chor said. He sounded exhausted. The outer ones have weeks or months. These 6. They're ready now. Ready to surface. Ready to surface. Rhee held the belay in position and looked at the 6 central structures and understood the geometry of the problem. 6. In the first wave. Then thousands more, staggered by development, weeks of them, months of them, surfacing in sequence into an ocean on a moon that had no defenses because it had never needed any. And then, eventually, wherever these things went when they were done growing. Which was not Skarath. Skarath was the nursery. It was not the destination. She said, record everything. Full spectrum. 20 seconds and then we're leaving. Das said, recording. The 20 seconds were the longest she had ever sat still. At 17 seconds, Tav stopped breathing. She noticed because she was attuned to the small sounds of the belay and the small sounds of the people in it, and his breathing was a sound she had catalogued over the 6 weeks they'd worked together, and its absence registered the way an alarm registers, not loudly, but with certainty. She looked at him. He was facing the central structures. His hands were flat on the panel, both of them, the same position as before, palms down, receptive. His whole body had the quality she had noticed earlier but more extreme, the quality of something listening with surfaces other than ears. His face was not blank. It was full of something she could not read, something that was not his face in the way she knew his face. Underneath it was him. Inside it was something older. 20, Das said. Tav. Rhee's voice was level, but she put her hand on his arm. He was warm, warmer than baseline, she could feel it through his sleeve. Tav. We're leaving. His hands lifted from the panel. He turned to look at her and his eyes were present again, but only just. Behind them, something large and very old was in the process of withdrawing. She had the sensation of watching a tide go out. He said, yes. We're leaving. He took the co-pilot controls and his movements were precise and correct and did not acknowledge what had just happened, and she matched his silence because the nursery was around them and the tenders were below them and this was not the moment to have that conversation. She began to turn the belay toward the exit path. And then one of the central structures moved. It did not break its membrane. It did not open. It simply shifted its orientation, a slow, massive turn, unhurried, like a planet adjusting its axis, and the end of it was now facing the belay directly. 40 meters of something nearly ready to exist, pointed at them with a precision that could not be accidental. The floor below them erupted. 2 tenders came up from the substrate like things that had been waiting, and they were faster than anything that size should have been, and they were no longer moving in the patterns that made them ignorable. Rhee had the throttle open before she finished registering what was happening, and the belay lurched forward, and she heard one of the tenders impact the hull on the starboard side. A sound like being hit by something that was deciding how hard to hit you, exploratory, and the decision was to be harder next time. Path, she said. Lost, Tav said. He was pulling it up on his screen, rerouting. Give me 8 seconds. We don't. 7 seconds, 6. The second tender hit the port underside and the belay rolled 15 degrees before Rhee corrected it, and through the viewport she saw the tender's surface briefly illuminated by their lights. It was changing. Reshaping its leading edge into something that was not a flat surface anymore, something with structure, something with, she didn't look anymore. She watched the navigation screen. Got it, Tav said. Hard to port, 11 degrees, go. She went. The path he'd found was not the one they'd come in on. It was shorter and more direct and passed closer to the hanging sack clusters than anything she would have chosen deliberately, but the tenders were behind them and the aperture was ahead of them, and she flew the path he'd given her with everything the belay's engines could produce without exceeding safe compression tolerance, which at this depth was a number she was trying not to think about. A sack brushed the starboard side of the hull. She felt it in the vibration of the yoke, not a collision, not a puncture, just the elastic resistance of something large giving way to something harder and faster. She heard, very clearly, the pulse of whatever was inside it. The rhythm was fast. Faster than before. She heard it in her blood, which was a thing she would never say to anyone. The tenders fell behind. Or gave up. Or returned to whatever they'd been doing. The nursery space opened up around the exit cylinder and she took them through it at a speed that made the filaments on the wall stream flat and the aperture iris contracted slightly as they passed through it. Not quickly enough, not enough to matter, and then they were outside and the membrane wall was behind them and Veritha's deep water was around them, cold and empty and ordinary in the way that ordinary had never seemed so valuable. Rhee pulled the belay into a vertical ascent path and opened the throttle and climbed. "Systems check," she said. "Das ran it. Port sensor array, 60%. Starboard lateral camera, offline. Hull integrity, nominal, the contact didn't breach." A pause. "We're intact." "Chaw." "Here," said Chaw, who was white-faced and gripping his console and present, which was all she needed him to be. "Tav." Tav was looking at his hands. They were resting in his lap, palms up. He was looking at them the way you look at a thing that surprised you, not alarmed, but puzzled, the way you look at hands you thought you knew and are now not certain about. Rhee said nothing. She watched the depth gauge count upward. She listened to the belay climb. At 1,800 meters, Tav said, "I didn't do it on purpose." She had been waiting for this. "I know." In the center. When I stopped. I wasn't making a decision. "I know." It was, he stopped. Tried again. It was like a frequency. Like something was, he stopped again. His jaw tightened. "I have Skarath biology. I know what that means in practice. I know what the pressure tolerance means, and the thermal regulation, and the sensory range. I've had 31 years to know what it means." He looked at his hands again. "I didn't know what that means." Rhee kept climbing. The depth gauge turned. She said, "What was the frequency?" A long pause. "Recognition," he said. At 800 meters, the external temperature spiked. Thermal anomaly, same depth as before, but not the same scale. The belay shuddered and she corrected and the instrument screamed a warning and then the temperature dropped back toward ambient and the shudder passed and the instruments quieted. Das said, "That wasn't the current anomaly." "No," Rhee agreed. "That was a displacement event. Something below us pushed a wave." "How large?" Das was quiet for 4 seconds. "Very large." Rhee climbed. At 400 meters, Chaw said, "How long have they been building this?" Nobody answered. It wasn't a question that had a good answer. It was the kind of question you asked when you needed to say something because the alternative was to say nothing, and saying nothing was the acknowledgement that you had understood something too large to process. At 150 meters, a faint luminescence appeared in the water below them, far below, rising. She watched it on the sensors and said nothing and climbed. At 60 meters, she could see the surface above them, the silvered underside of the water, backlit by Oscail's ambient light, close enough to look like safety. At 30 meters, the luminescence below was no longer distant. She broke the surface at maximum safe ascent velocity, which was a speed she had never actually used before because in standard operations there is always time to decelerate. The belay emerged from the water with a sound like rupture and the hull hit the air and Veritha's grey-green sky was above them and the ocean was below them and she immediately cut vertical thrust and let them settle, bobbing, on the surface. Rhee opened the comm. "Ardent Meridian, this is belay, we are on surface, we are intact, requesting immediate uplift." She paused. "And I need to speak to Admiral Casson." Static. The kind of static that means signal processing, not the kind that means no signal. Then, behind the belay, something broke the surface. She did not see it immediately. She heard it. The sound of something very large moving through the boundary between water and air, not the sound of a splash, not the sound of an impact, but the sound of a boundary yielding. The sound of water being replaced by volume. Tav was looking out the rear viewport. Rhee turned. It was ascending slowly, the way large things ascend, not dramatically, not explosively, but with the patience of something that has been waiting for a long time and has no particular urgency now that the waiting is done. It cleared the surface by what her eye estimated as 30 meters and was still rising, still revealing itself, its surface dark and ridged where it was dry, translucent and gleaming where the water was still running off it. It was oriented upward, looking, if looking was a concept that applied, at Oskal hanging massive in the sky. 40 meters long. Perhaps 50. She revised upward. Perhaps larger. Still growing as she watched, not growing, expanding, unfolding, the shape it had held in the sack was not its full shape. It was impossibly alive. That was the phrase her mind gave her, and she understood why, because the alternative was to generate a technical description and her technical systems had simply stopped. Meridian, she said. Her voice was steady. She was, she thought, a professional. Be advised, visual confirmation of biological entity emerging from Verith surface, coordinates transmitting. Entity dimensions estimated 40 to 60 meters. Single entity. There are several thousand more in the structure below. She looked at the entity for another moment. Classification unknown. Behavior, non-aggressive at current time. Standing by for instruction. She released the comm and waited. The static continued. The entity had fully cleared the surface now and was floating. Hovering was the more accurate word, though she did not know what was keeping it aloft, perhaps 30 meters above the water. It turned, slowly, the way the central structure had turned in the nursery. The way a thing turns when it is orienting on something. It turned toward the belay. Rhee's hand went to the emergency depth controls without conscious decision, and then Cassan's voice came over the comm and her hand stopped. Captain Rhee. His voice was different from the briefing. Not the standing voice. This is Cassan. We have your signal and your telemetry. Admiral. Requesting instructions. A silence. Long. Longer than Comlag could explain. Then, we know. His voice was careful. Precisely calibrated. The voice of someone choosing words that would carry the minimum necessary information. Stand by. She looked at Tav. Tav was not looking at her. He was looking at the entity through the viewport, the thing floating 30 meters above the water 20 meters behind them. His face had the quality it had had in the nursery, that deep, listening quality, but it was not alien now. It was something she could name. It was recognition meeting recognition. It was the face of someone who has heard their name called from very far away. He said, very quietly, as though he was telling her something that he himself had only just understood. It recognized me. The comm was open. Oskal hung in the sky. The water around the belay was still. Behind them the entity moved, or breathed, or simply continued to exist, and Rhee sat in the pilot's seat of a vessel that smelled of recycled air and machine oil and something else now, something that had come in with them, something that did not have a name in any database she had ever accessed, and she looked at Tav, and he looked at the water, and from the deep all around them came the first faint luminescence of the next one beginning to surface.